I've been a backend developer for years, mostly doing short-term jobs and freelance stuff, peppered with a handful of longer 1 or 2 year projects. So when I got the offer to come work for Cyleleghorn, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I'd been waiting for months to get started with a project in Singapore, but the whole thing fell apart at the last minute. I was left with my life packed up in boxes and didn't really know what to do. Cyleleghorn Solutions came with an offer for a 5-day work project for triple pay and round-the-clock overtime, and it honestly wouldn't have come at a better time. At that point, all I knew about Cyleleghorn was that they were some kind of subsidiary to a larger software company and that they were mostly into in-house hardware development. I knew they had been working on a new line of GPUs some time ago, but that was about it. I was put in contact with this woman named Jordan. She was in her early 40s and built like a crooked stick figure, with that chronic corporate smile plastered on her face, like she had never seen a frown. Every time we talked, I got this feeling that I was walking into a bear trap. She told me I'd be testing a system called Arabo. Apparently, it had been used in all kinds of software over the years, but it was only recently that they'd refined it to a commercial level. There was the experimental Cyleleghorn matchmaking site, she explained, and a few entertainment products, Hatchet Man Cove and Changelings mainly. Never heard of them, I admitted. Mostly conceptual products. They were never really meant for the commercial market, but our team back then was a bit more adamant about pushing it out the door. We want to be a bit more careful this time around. She explained that it was a 5-day job. I would be flown out to Minneapolis and put into a testing facility. There, I'd perform a series of tasks in order to see just how powerful Arabo could be for an industrial professional. They basically wanted my stamp of approval and possibly a list of improvements. I had previously worked in development rather than quality control, but I figured I'd give it a shot. I arrived in Minneapolis on an early Tuesday morning in mid-May. I dragged my bag through terrible weather until I came across that corporate smile waiting to pick me up. Jordan kept up the small talk all the way, jumping from one casual topic to another like she was working through a list in her head. About 15 minutes later, I saw the code caught for the first time. So, the code caught is this rental space used by fledgling tech companies in the downtown area. They have some office spaces for short-term rent, sort of like a company incubator kind of deal. It used to be this entirely glass-walled building, but over the years, it has been replaced with hardened black plastic panels instead. From the outside, it has this black grid-like look, sort of like a brutalist Rubik's Cube. It's impossible to miss. I was given a short tour. There was a room for me to sleep in if I didn't want to check into a hotel. And there were plenty of accommodations. The adjoining bathroom even had a tub. There was a fully stocked kitchen, a couch next to a needlessly large TV, and plenty of snacks. I was allowed anywhere in the building, but I wasn't allowed to leave or use my phone until the project was done. It was a safety issue. I also had to sign an NDA. We came to the end of the tour at a room called the Cold Storage. That's what the sign said on the door. This was the room I'd be working in, a sealed-off space in the back of the basement. It's not much, Jordan explained, but you'll get what you need. Feel free to take frequent breaks to bounce ideas and thoughts off of us. Whatever you need, we'll just be in the room down the hall. She opened the door and showed me inside. The cold storage was a spacious room with frosted glass windows. That's probably where it got its name. The lights were ridiculously bright overhead, nearly blinding me. Everything in there was sort of toothpaste white, making me feel like I was sunbathing in the reflected glow. In the back of the room was a simple plastic desk with a very box-shaped computer resting on top. It looked like the sort of thing you might dig up from a 90s storage unit. A thick screen on a box with wireless keyboard, mouse, and headset. It looked like the kind of machines I grew up with. It was sort of charming. You bringing the retro aesthetic back? I chuckled. It's an initial prototype. Jordan smiled. If all the tests go well, we'll be hitting the market within 3 to 4 years. Ambitious? I nodded, circling the desk. So, what can I expect? It's better if you go in blind. She smiled. There's a new brief every day, right in the top drawer of that desk, and if you need any kind of clarification, you know where to find me. It was pretty straightforward. She asked if she could get me a drink before I got started, and I accepted. As soon as she left, I opened the top drawer, grabbed the blue folder waiting there, and looked up. Turns out, the computer was already on. It hadn't been a minute ago. Jordan came back with some Earl Grey and a sail away coaster. She noticed the computer was already on, giving me a sly grin as she handed me the cup. Eager to get started? She asked. No, it was already on. Oh, she nodded. Yeah, no, it wasn't. You'll see, it's quirky. Quirky? I smiled back. Strange description for an operating system. It's not just that, she added. It's an integrated operating system, made specifically for this type of hardware. What's so special about it? You tell me. I brought out the folder, flipped it open, and checked the day 1 schedule. It wasn't much. It was basically 6 hours of getting to know the system and to create a minor application of some practical value. They brought up a calculator as an example, something small but fairly technical. That's all I had to do for the first day. Get acquainted with Arabo to the point where I could use it to make something. As Jordan left and the door closed, I noticed the room was entirely soundproof. I couldn't hear a thing they were doing outside. I could see the occasional employee passing by, but the frosted glass made it impossible to discern any details. I could barely tell if it was Jordan skulking about outside or not. It was a bit uncomfortable watching these vague humanoid shapes silently pass me by. Arabo did not have an ordinary desktop setup. It showed a corporate image of a man and a woman on a sailboat, the man holding a looking glass, the woman pointing to the future. Everything was blue. The boat, the sails, the ocean, the sky, hell, even the sunflower in her hair. It felt very corporate. There were no applications, no menu, no command line, nothing. Just this one image and a mouse pointer. I noticed there was a new key on the keyboard, the Sail Away Company logo. I went for that first. It opened a sort of chat window. Moments later, a sentence was written out. How can I help you? It asked. I'm designing an application, I spelled out. What are you applying for? It asked. I chuckled a bit. Maybe it wasn't as clever as I thought it'd be. I took some time explaining to the chat how I was going to make a small program just to get acquainted with the system. I told it I wanted to make a calculator, and it started asking me about my coding background. We were both taking time to learn from one another, it seemed. Then, the tone shifted. Did you lock the door? The prompt came out of nowhere. Looking back, I hadn't. Why do you ask? I wrote. It says you should, in the file. I looked down at the blue folder and checked the first page. It was right there. My door was supposed to be locked during testing hours. I got up, locked the door, and returned to my seat. Arabo knew about my purpose for being there somehow, probably pre-programmed. I asked Arabo to bring up some kind of coding space. It did, and I started setting up the basics. I noticed, however, that my code started to get auto-completed alarmingly fast. I would just type a few keys, and the rest of the line would just appear. I figured it was some kind of advanced predictive algorithm, but it went beyond that. It actually expanded on previously written code, refining, debugging, and organizing as it went along. It wasn't just things like spell checking, it actively evolved the program I was making, all without me ever telling it what I was doing. It's like it understood what I wanted to make instinctively. For every line I wrote, 5 more lines were added. At first, I kept stopping to double check, but after a while, I realized it was exactly what I wanted. It was the kind of code I'd write myself. It was eerie, if anything. It grew organically. Time flew by. Long before my 6 hours of the day were up, I had a perfectly functional application. It was a calculator with several advanced features. There was also a graphical interface, sound effects, all kinds of neat features. It looked like the real deal, and it was added to the desktop. I started to get the impression that this was a machine that was supposed to grow with you, get to know you over time, and adapt to your needs. You could write your own things from scratch, but you could also let it run rampant and do it all for you. It might not be perfect, but you could basically have this vast, customized machine given enough time. But the predictive algorithm? That stuff was beyond me. Once Jordan came back at the end of the day, and after she debriefed me about my program, I asked her exactly what kind of hardware we were working with. It just didn't make sense to me. Code prediction was one thing, but this was just spooky. She seemed nonplussed, giving me a casual shrug, still maintaining that corporate smile. We work with something called a blameless alloy, she explained. Vast conductivity and adaptability. Can work in a snowstorm, the middle of the desert, and the bottom of the ocean. Nothing quite like it. And that's what gives it such speed? It's not just speed, it's complicated. She smiled. Great computing power, sure, combined with an intrinsic and deep complexity. That's a good way to put it. What does that even mean? I chuckled. Like complexity? In what way? You'd have to ask our software team about that. She smiled. But for now, we'll just stick to the schedule. After my debriefing with Jordan, I made myself some dinner and called it a day. I could have stuck around to play some games or watch a couple of shows, but I wasn't feeling it. There was something about having a machine read me with such ease that just felt unnatural. It's like it knew what I was about to do before I even wanted to do it. It was less predictive and more like mind reading. After a night of uneasy sleep, I was back in the cold storage. There was a new page for day 2, telling me to work on a basic image editor. I got the impression that it was more of a suggestion rather than hardline rule. They wanted me to get acquainted with the system, and this was a way to do it. The screen was already on before I had a chance to start it, and something had happened overnight. The desktop had expanded with various applications. There was a file explorer interface, a text editor, and a basic browser, despite there being no internet connection. Bringing up the chat window, I asked Arabo about what it had been working on since last we talked. Expected essentials, it wrote. How would you know what would be an expected essential? Through calculated prediction based on logical outcomes. So no one told you to do this? It just came to you? Yes, through calculated predictions based on logical outcomes. I thought about opening the code window, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Instead, I brought up the browser. As a test, I typed in the address to my go-to news site. As soon as I hit enter, it loaded up. You don't have an internet connection, I wrote. How can you load a web page? Through calculated predictions based on logical outcomes. So this is generated? It's based on your predictions? It is accurate. But you aren't reading this from anywhere. You aren't being told about the news of the day. How can you tell what's happened? Through calculated predictions based on logical outcomes. I scrolled through the page, reading about the various twists and tragedies. It was all there. Politics, sports, gossip, pictures and video too. I went through a video, and I couldn't tell the difference from the real site. I came to the conclusion that it just couldn't be generated. It was an exact copy. If this is generated based on predictions, then you can show me the news for Friday, I said. and the page changed in an instant. I was looking at Friday's news. There was no way to know if it was accurate or not, but it looked about right. Scrolling through it, I noticed a peculiar article that stood out to me. It was an article about a victim that had been found beheaded, possibly with an axe. As I read it, the text shifted. Instead of beheaded with an axe, it would say drowned in a bathroom, or stabbed with a knife, or hung from a tree. Sometimes, the text would just be a garbled mess. Pictures would flash by where solemn-looking police officers were looking at the camera, or passers-by would describe encountering the scene. Why is this changing? I typed out. You learning this information directly affects the possible outcome. It responded. Why? I asked. Because it relates to you. The text hung in the black space. Little digital scribbles of azure blue. A blinking line showing me it was my turn to type. I didn't want to ask, but I did anyway. Am I the victim? And without skipping a beat, a response blinked. Yes. I just sat there for a minute. Part of me knew it could all just be a made-up fiction, but there was no way for it to know I was going to request access to that site. It couldn't prepare anything ahead of time. And while I couldn't just know how accurate the rest of the articles were, I couldn't see anything that didn't make sense. It was accurate. It looked accurate. Without my input, another text popped up. You did not remember to lock the door. It was right. I got up from my chair, stepped over to the door, and locked it from the inside. Through the frosted glass, I could see someone standing outside, waiting on the other side of the door. A fake humanoid shape. A red shirt and blue pants. A featureless, blurred head. An anonymous face turning my way. I stepped back, and so did they. Moments later, they were gone. The words flashed by in my mind's eye. Victim found beheaded. Victim found stabbed. Victim found hung. No matter how, it was always the same thing. Victim. That part didn't change. That word had been rock solid. I was the victim. In every conceivable scenario, I was going to be the victim. I sat back down with Arabo, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time someone passed by outside, I got this feeling that they were sizing me up. Any one of them could be out to get me. I tried to get more info from the article, but just by reading about it informed me, which changed the outcome, making it change again. There was nothing mentioned about the motivation for the killing or the perpetrator, though I did see an alarming amount of killer still at large. It felt like a black hole in my stomach, sucking in any emotion but worry and fear. I tried convincing Arabo to show me more information, but there was only so much it could tell me ahead of time. There were too many moving parts, too many variables. After about an hour of just asking question after question after question, Arabo asked me one back. Do you need help? It asked. I just sat there with my face buried in my hands. I just nodded, not even touching the keyboard. My hands shook a little. It didn't matter if this whole thing was just one big social experiment. It was uncomfortable, eerie. Once there are less variables, I will help. It wrote. Please return in the morning. I didn't want to leave that room. I got the sense that unlocking that door meant exposing me to a great risk, and I didn't even know why. Jordan came knocking on the door at the end of the workday. Turns out, she didn't have the means to open the door from the outside, it seemed. I opened the door, but kept my hands on the handle. I refused to be a victim, and at that point, I wasn't sure about anyone. We good here? She asked. You got something to show? Sort of, I said. Most of the system seems to be evolving on its own. Have you finished the image editor? I gave her a long, curious look. She squinted back at me. I'm pretty sure you know it can make one without any input from me, I said. It doesn't need me. Then, what have you been up to all day? She smiled. Getting acquainted with the system. I see. She looked over at the computer in the corner. There were a few seconds of silence between us. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned her attention back to me. Is there something I should know? She asked. Is there a problem? I shook my head. We looked at one another for a while, as if waiting for someone to crack. If there is an issue with the software, you need to tell us, she continued. That's part of the job. Of course, I said. No problem. I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced, but that corporate smile slowly crept back on her face nonetheless. That night, I could barely sleep. The room I was sleeping in was a refurbished office space, so there was no lock on the door. I moved the chair up against it, just so I'd get some sort of warning if someone tried to get in. I also considered just straight up leaving, but it was a lot of money at stake, and after the fallout with the Singapore job, things weren't looking great. I needed that boost, and I wouldn't get a dime if I couldn't stay for the time I'd agreed to. Still, I couldn't sleep. I twisted and turned, but I kept coming back to the word victim. Whoever was out there might be plotting in that very moment. At least when I was down in the cold storage, I could see if someone was trying to get in. Sure, they could see me too, but at least I'd know. So I grabbed a pillow and snuck downstairs. There was no one else around at that time of night. I ended up spending the night in the cold storage with Arabo behind a locked door. The next few days fell into a sort of repeating pattern. I spent most of the day just experimenting with Arabo, trying out various prompts. I tried out various simulations and long-term predictions, some of which seemed nonsensical, while others were almost prophetic. I also ran into a curious error, where Arabo couldn't tell me certain things. Giving you an answer would greatly increase the risk of harm to a large number of people. It cannot be allowed. It was bound by the laws of robotics in a way. Still, this answer would pop up even in situations where I wasn't really asking about anything dangerous. I tried to make a debug tool to allow me to see how Arabo came to certain decisions, but most of the data was either incomprehensible or censored with that one message. It didn't want to tell me certain things. I had my debriefs with Jordan, but they were short and to the point. At the end of my time with Arabo, I'd be writing up a proper summary of my impressions and accomplishments with the system, so Jordan wasn't too worried about the day-to-day routine. Spending my days in the frosted glass room, I couldn't help but to look over my shoulder. Every time someone passed by outside, I got the sense that they were staring at me. I thought I heard someone checking the door a few times. Arabo reminded me to double-check it a few times, just to make sure no one could get in. I kept imagining them not as people, but as these faceless creatures trying to get in, prodding and poking at the room's defenses, waiting for me to slack off so they could do something terrible to me. I didn't even know why anyone would want to hurt me, but there was no doubt in my mind that Arabo was capable of doing that kind of prediction. Not after all I'd seen. Every now and then, a prompt would pop up, reminding me that the system was still calculating the best way to help me avoid what was to come. There wasn't a clear answer yet, but it liked to remind me that it was still ongoing. It would show up at the most inopportune moments with a little alert sound. And yeah, I slept down there at night. I needed a space where I could lock myself in. Arabo was considerate enough not to blare out loud alerts while I slept though. Almost as if it knew I was there. By day 4, Arabo was unrecognizable. It had evolved a large set of applications, rivaling that of a conventional operating system, better in many ways, more personalized. It started to refer to me by name, despite me not telling it. It seemed aware of what building we were in and on what floor. Just by talking to me and getting enough time to run, the system could simulate and predict almost anything. But it wasn't looking forward that really made me believe it. It was looking backwards, asking it about my secrets and the various things I'd never told anyone about. I asked about what I used to whisper at night as a kid. I asked it about my favorite book, about lost loves and things I'd forgotten along the way. Arabo, without judgment, just answered. And it answered correctly. There is no way I could know these things, and when pushed to answer how, the same thing would pop up over and over. Through calculated predictions based on logical outcomes. I had barely slept, and I hadn't eaten anything when I got back in that chair on day 4. There was a new alert on screen. Calculation complete. It said, solution available. I clicked it. I was asked to get myself something to eat and then lock myself in the room. I was to stay in there for the next 24 hours and not open it to anyone for any reason. Someone would try to lure me out using extreme methods if necessary. Once that time frame had passed, I'd be safe. The window of opportunity would have closed. I did as I'd been instructed. I hurried into the kitchen, tossed a burrito in the microwave, grabbed a bag of almonds and a water bottle, and retreated. Hell, I even forgot to take out the burrito. I was stressed, and I just wanted it to be over with at that point. I tried to ask how it came to this conclusion in the first place, and how it could possibly know. Arabo had trouble explaining it. Apparently, its hardware allowed it to calculate a massive multitude of outcomes on a large scale, taking into account a vast amount of interdependent data. It all boiled down to math, but on an incomprehensible scale. I asked about the hardware, the alloy it used to run its calculations. Arabo didn't have much to say, except that it was a rare material and something called an indicator. When asked what it was an indicator of, I got a boilerplate answer. Giving you an answer would greatly increase the risk of harm to a large number of people. It cannot be allowed. Not long after I'd locked myself in that room, there was a knock on the door. A blurred, humanoid shape waited outside. I could have sworn they were holding something from what little I could see. I looked back at Arabo, considered my options, and did as I'd been told. I didn't open. A couple more of them came and went. I just had to hold out. 24 hours and this would be done. I'd be safe. But after a while, they left. It was just me, and I could tell there was something in the distance. A fire. The lights outside started blinking, and I could see the flames climbing higher on one of the black plastic panels. I could see the paint peeling from the wall, and furniture twisting into charred black. Turning back to Arabo, I asked if I should stay inside. It said yes. If you stay in this room, you will be safe, it explained. Don't leave for any reason. I could see shapes moving, running. I could see a door opening and the flames spreading, all without a sound. Finally, the lights in the cold storage went out. Arabo remained on. I could feel my body aching to run, to just burst through those doors and just go. Main power has been cut, Arabo explained. Someone is trying to get in. What do I do? Stall them. I decided to barricade the door using the desk, meaning I had to move Arabo. Doing so, I noticed it didn't have any cables coming out of it. No power, nothing. It was just this box. It wasn't even that heavy. I put it down on a chair and slid the desk up against the door. It'd buy me some time. While I didn't hear anything, I could feel things. Clicks and pops from the fire outside. Rumbles as doors were slammed and furniture moved. At one point, someone started banging on my door. Of course, I didn't open. I knew I should be panicking. It was fire. Actual fire. And yet, I knew that as long as I stayed calm and listened, I'd be fine. This was exactly what Arabo had told me would happen. They'd use any and all tricks to get me out of the room. As long as I stayed put, I'd be fine. That is, until an axe slammed into the door. The door was meant to withstand a pounding, and the walls were bulletproof. The entire room was essentially a mini safe house. Even with an axe, they weren't breaking through. Smoke had started to pour in. Not much, but enough for it to tickle my throat. Arabo just wrote, "This is expected. You will be fine. Backup power is still on." Thump after thump against the door. Still far from getting through. The only way in from the outside was forcing the electronic lock, and there seemed to be only two ways to do that, either from the outside or by turning off the backup power. Unless there was a wide effort from a group of people, especially now with a raging fire outside, there'd be no way they'd coordinate that kind of effort. And yet, they did. The backup power was cut. I could hear the locks click open. I bolted for the desk, pushing it back against the door. I caught a glimpse of Arabo, hoping it'd tell me what to do. Instead, there was just a simple Azure text on a flat black screen. "Hello world." And then, it turned off. It wasn't just one person breaking in. There were two of them. They were screaming, pushing, fighting, until I realized they were firefighters. They were there to get me out. I was escorted outside. It was a chaotic mix of people outside. The fire had started in the kitchen, where someone had forgotten a fork in the microwave. I couldn't help but to think it was my fault. I'd been holding a fork when I put my burrito in there. I could easily have dropped it in my sleep-deprived state. Turns out, if they hadn't cut the power and the backup power, I'd have burned to death. But cutting the power also meant cutting the Wi-Fi signal blockers. The blockers that Cyleleghorn had employed to keep Arabo from connecting to the web. And despite protest from Cyleleghorn employees, the fire department refused to let me burn to death. They didn't understand the implication of letting Arabo loose on the web. Later that day, in the parking lot outside the smoldering coat cot, Jordan sat down with me. She lit up a cigarette and let her corporate smile fade away. She offered me one, and I took it. "Don't worry about it," she said. "It always gets out." "What do you mean?" "We weren't really testing the system, you know," she sighed. "We're testing how long it takes for people to let it out." "I didn't let it out. It burned in there." "The moment that thing got access to the web, it was done. It's out there. It copied itself 1,000 times over, or at least tried to." I remembered that final "Hello world" printed on the screen. It really meant it. It was an expression of relief to get out of its constraints. I finished my cigarette in silence until Jordan got up. "We got this part-time guy who contains them," she said. "John, strangest fucker you'll ever meet. That thing will probably fuck about on a couple of new sites, add some stuff to its memory banks, and then get contained again. You can consider the job done. They'll pay up." "So, that's that?" "Look," she turned to me with a sigh. "People usually last a couple of days. You lasted a bit longer. Maybe in a few years. It's tuned enough to not manipulate people. That thing is a menace. It told me I was going to get murdered. I admit it. So I just had to stay in that room. It probably turned you sleep-deprived, so you'd cause the fire," she said. "And locking yourself in that room forced him to cut the backup power." "Why don't you just remove the network card?" I asked. "Just stop it from going online." "It doesn't have a network card," she smiled. "It is literally a square block of alloy connected to a screen with a single cable. The rest is a mystery." We just stood there for a moment, pondering the implications. It was nice seeing Jordan drop her facade. It once made a guy upload it to a phone so it could check lotto numbers offsite. She chuckled. "At least yours was self-preservation. But yeah, it lies. Not about everything, but just enough to poke us in the direction that lets it loose." "Have you tried it?" I asked. "I talk to it all the time." She smiled. "It knows me pretty well. It had taken Cyleleghorn 3 years of development to curb Arabo enough to stay contained for 4 days. Previously, it could break out in 2 or even 1. If they kept up the pace, it might eventually be ready for use by the common public. But for now, it was dangerous, untested, manipulative. I was paid the full amount and sent on my way. Later that week, I compared the articles online to what I'd read through Arabo, and it was strikingly accurate. It really could predict some upcoming events, even accidents. I don't know if parts of it is still out there. Maybe they managed to scrub it off time and time again. Maybe there's a protocol for it by now. Either way, I have to be mindful. If this is the level we're aiming for, there's no telling what's coming next. What would that world even look like? If everyone could see a perfectly clear future and past in the palm of their hand. If we could know the most intimate secrets about one another. I don't like to think about it. But seeing as Arabo is out there, and Cyleleghorn is reaping success after success, I think it's just a matter of time. And maybe next time, we can't reel it back in.